Hello. Thank you for joining us for the 18th State of the River Report for the Lower St. Johns River Basin. I'm Dr. Gretchen Billmeyer-Fraser, and I'm joined by my colleagues Dr. Chris Baynard, Dr. Scott Jones, and Dr. Jerry Pinto. So this report started in 2008, and it's been produced annually since then. It's funded by the City of Jacksonville and the Environmental Protection Board, and the purpose is to inform the public about the health of the Lower St. Johns River Basin. It's also the second purpose is to provide independent assessments of the status and trends of various health indicators. There are several authors of this report, including Dr. Jerry Pinto, Dr. Nisa Goldberg, Dr. William Penwell, and myself from Jacksonville University, Dr. Brian Zellner, Dr. Chris Baynard, Dr. Dale Casamata, and Dr. Scott Jones from the University of North Florida, as well as Dr. Radha Piatti from Penn State Berks. The technical editor is Nikki Spadero. David Smith handled the brochure design, and David Wilson and Kayla Little handled the website. We'd like to start by thanking all of the reviewers and advisors of this report. There are many, including St. Johns River Water Management District, City of Jacksonville, Florida Department of Health, the FDEP, JEA, St. Johns River Keepers, and many others. They have put in hours of work to help review and advise about this report, and we greatly appreciate the help. The website can be found at sjrreport.com, and the report includes the background section and a guide for general public, K through 12 educational resources on the Lower St. Johns River Basin, and then sections on water quality, fisheries, aquatic life, and contaminants, including a new part about pharmaceuticals and PFAS. The full report, appendices, and brochure can be found at the report and at the website. And the website is highly interactive, so you can search by district, by planning district or council district. There are also maps and data that visualize the vulnerabilities along the St. Johns River, as well as lesson plans and educational resources for teachers. The maps and data that visualize the vulnerability along the St. Johns River were produced by Dr. Ashley Johnson from Jacksonville University. And these maps include sanitary sewer overflows, impaired water, septic tanks, aquifer vulnerabilities, and a lot of other information. They are very useful. There are also educational resources for teachers, and those were produced by Drs. Zellner, Ouellette, Klossman, Goldberg, Johnson, and Pinto. And these include video clips on a variety of topics, including algal blooms, manatees, an oral history of the people who live, work, and recreate on the St. Johns River. If you go to the website, you can search by topic. If you're interested in fisheries, for example, or you would like to know about the health of a particular fish species, you can look up that information, or water quality, contaminants, and so forth. And you can also go to a particular tributary. So if you live alongside a tributary and you'd like to know about the water quality or the health, you can search that tributary and you're provided with a wealth of information. So I definitely suggest taking a look at the website. Again, there's a lot of information that can be used. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Chris Baynard.
Thank you. So again, this is the 18th year of the State of the River Report. I've been involved for the last few years, but our fearless leader, Dr. Pinto over here, has been taking charge, and so we appreciate that. I'm also building a lot on the work of Dr. Klossman, Dr. Charles Klossman, environmental history professor at UNF. And we'll start with a couple of maps. You can see one here from the 1818, beginning 19th century. You can see the mouth of the St. Johns River and the bar, and then compare it to a satellite image of the present. And some of the features are still recognizable. So for example, though it says there, Isla de San Juan, or San Juan Island today is Fort George Island, and the meanders in the river and the mouth where Mayport is today. And even Fort Caroline, you can kind of picture it there if that's the true location. So we're looking at 4 major categories with recreation, environment, economy, and human well-being. And we're showing there on the right a map. The green polygon represents the lower St. Johns River Basin, the area of study here. and the blue represents the river. Moving on, just to give you an idea of how large the study area is, this yellow polygon again represents the basin, and it touches 9 counties. Really affects 6, but it does touch 9, so you can see how large the basin is, the amount of land that is involved. So some of the key takeaways, we're looking at water quality. In the main stem of the river, the water quality is suitable for boating, other forms of recreation, and fishing. But it's the tributaries that are the ones that are problematic, and my colleague's going to talk more about them. And there, the public should exercise caution, especially when they're fishing or swimming. This image here just shows some turbidity arising from some land use or land disturbing activities back in 2008. So some of the key takeaways, so as a geographer, geospatial analyst, we're looking at land use, land cover change, and what you're seeing here is the main part of the northern part of our study area is red. That's where all the development, urbanization is taking place. And so we're comparing that to the diminishing wetlands, which are in very light blue. Right now, the wetlands are about 25% of the basin, and the urban areas almost the same amount. And we expect that to just keep changing and growing with more development as more people move here to Florida. Then the green areas represent forested or vegetated areas. And those will also decrease as urbanization increases. So to give you another perspective, we're looking at a 2014 image on the left and 2024. So just 10 years, if you look closely, you can see some of the changes in just urban development. And this is on the eastern and south side of Duval County. And then Nocatee. Most of Nocatee falls in St. Johns County and not within the basin. Part of it does fall in there. But this just illustrates how much this area is growing over time between 2014 and 11 years later. We start with a little dot in the middle, what was Nocatee, and now it's extended like octopus, branches all over the place. So this development has been quite successful in that respect, but you can see the growth and changes over time. And of course, all those changes also affect local tributaries in the river. By the way, if you're interested in seeing these changes over time, you can see a link there, the Esri way back, and you can look at and create a timeline where the images pop, and you can see the differences year by year. So another one is salinity. It's increasing in some locations, and we have 3 areas. We divided the study area into 3. You can see the southern zone is light, or fresh water, the middle zone, and then the upper zone, the one that's closer where the river empties, and that's brackish water, or salt water and fresh water mixed together, and it reaches all the way to downtown. On water quality, I'll let my colleagues speak more about that and some of the parameters. One of the ones that always stands out is the harmful algae blooms, and they can talk more about that and how it affects the ecosystem. Some more maps, yay. So here we have, if you want to get an idea of the tributaries that you were talking about, you can look them up, and you can see the yellow polygons are the areas of study where the samples were taken. And then on the right, you can see how many tributaries were examined and data gathered. So this is a very thorough and comprehensive study. And of course, there's always more to be done. Then aquatic and avian life, some bird populations and wood storks are doing well. Manatee populations are higher, though there are some threats, as we know, cold water, red tide, and the main one, reduced aquatic vegetation, especially in Indian River Lagoon, that affects manatee populations. And some of the fisheries are healthy. You can see some examples here, the spot-tailed bass, as we say in South Carolina, or here, right, the red drum, and then some others, including the flounder. Moving on, the blue crabs and the shrimp, especially the blue crabs right now is uncertain, and Dr. Pinto can talk more about that, about the reason why the numbers are hard to pin down. And then the shrimp, we have several species, and some are taken from the river, some are taken offshore. And might mention how we're going to try to get data to separate the two and get better information on those. So right now we're looking at uncertainty on both of them. Contaminants, so we know that mercury is bad for you, and if mercury are in the fish, and especially they bioaccumulate as the species get larger, so the recommendation is to eat 1 to maybe 8 meals per month of fish, and avoid consuming large ones like large sharks or large mackerel, which have higher levels. Septic tanks are, the failing ones are a problem and have been a problem for a long time. And they're looking at replacing a lot of them and modernizing the system, but there's still a lot of them do leak and contributes to fecal bacteria. And there's a lot of phosphorus also in the tributaries. The guide also includes information for boaters on etiquette, rules, and boater safety, looking at, as mentioned earlier, the information and lesson plans for teachers from kindergarten through 12th grade. And then there's also data and information on swimming and fishing. And here are some links that how the public can get involved. You can look at outdoor and hiking activities, and these are just some of the websites out there, community service, volunteering, and even reporting problems. The yellow indicates those are keywords to search for. So if you don't have access to these links, search for those keywords and you'll find these and many more. Also, you can check for environmental related news going to the St. John's Riverkeeper site, excellent place to find out what's going on. And you can see on the right, the Florida DEP has information that in alerts, for example, this one from October on green algae alert for the Mandarin Point area of the St. John's River. Other ways you can get involved. Join environmental related organizations, or you can donate funds. You can do a tribute gifting, like I could donate money on Dr. Jones's behalf, or in planned giving, right, for your estate. Also participate in walks for the clean water, trash pickups. You can also record and report observations. And this is when you can do, if you're walking and enjoying nature and use an app like iNaturalist, you can take photos of different species, plants and animals, and upload it and get information about it. If you were right or wrong, there's a series of experts who will provide information for you. And while you're walking around collecting these observations, you'll also notice things in and around the river. You might see some trash you're willing now to pick up that you wouldn't before because you're out there and enjoying nature and part of this. And then you can also contact your city council members. So we have this map showing the district council members in 2025. And number 6, Michael Boylan, right, our former director, right here at WJCT. He's now here and now taking care of District 6. And then those links there also take you to the councils. You can find their information on their phone numbers and websites and get in touch with them that way. And this final graphic is very nice, done by Heather McCarthy. Just presents different ways that you can get involved in activities and behaviors you can adopt to help reduce impacts to the river and help it keep it clean and healthy. And lastly, here's some acknowledgments of people who are obviously participating in this report. And I will move it and pass it on to Dr. Jones.
Thank you, Dr. Baynard. So I'll highlight some of the data, status and trends for the water quality section of the report. There are many, many different measures of water quality, and there's far too many to present in a short period of time. So if you go to the website and look up the report, you'll find much more information than I'll be able to highlight today. So I'll quickly highlight dissolved oxygen, nitrogen and phosphorus. And nitrogen and phosphorus are two nutrients we care a lot about as they influence many of the processes happening in the river. And we've presented those data and analyzed those data in a way that's different this year than past reports. So I'll spend a little bit of time discussing what changes we've made and why we've made those changes. And then I'll touch on the tributary section as well, which we've reorganized a little bit for this year's report. So for the dissolved oxygen, and this is a theme that you've heard already and we'll hear more of, in the main stem, there's plenty of oxygen in the water, and we would like oxygen to be in the water dissolved. That makes it much easier for the organisms that live there to survive. And that has been satisfactory for quite some time. In contrast, the tributaries are often unsatisfactory, depending on which tributary, what time of year, and where the samples are taken. So we'll get into tributaries at the very end of my section here. But I'm going to be showing you some data throughout this section. I want to show you the actual data that we're using to make our assessments in the report. And a lot of the figures are going to look very similar to this, where going from left to right, you have time or a year. So in this case, these data are going from 2005 to 2024, so about 20 years of dissolved oxygen data. On the vertical axis, going up and down, is the amount of some nutrient or water quality measure, in this case, dissolved oxygen. So we want that to be higher. It's pretty much the only measure that we would like to be high. Mostly we want low values of contaminants and nutrients and other things, but we want lots of oxygen. So any blue or red coloring, blue is good in this case. Red gets a bad rap, but I'll continue to support that. But red is where we don't want the data. We want the data in the blue, which means that is, in the case of dissolved oxygen, above our criteria, or for everything else, below our criteria. So you can see in the freshwater on the left and the marine or estuarine sections of the main stem, so the main river, the St. John's, dissolved oxygen looks good. It's high above the water quality criteria. There's plenty of oxygen dissolved in the water for critters to be using, and it hasn't really changed much over the past few decades. So satisfactory levels and not really a trend. So that's good news for dissolved oxygen in the main stem. And the tributaries we'll talk about at the very end after discussing nitrogen. And nitrogen also is fairly satisfactory. So in general, in the main stem and across most of the tributaries, the level of nitrogen is below the water quality criteria, which means lower than what would concern us. So it's satisfactory. And it's been satisfactory for some time, several years. To show you that, this is a little bit different. So this section has been analyzed in a different way this year. So what we have done in the past is take all of the different chunks of the freshwater main stem, so different sections of the river, and presented them as one number. So that gives you a really good idea at a broad scale of how the river is doing. So we've decided this year for nitrogen and phosphorus to break out those sections and get a little finer scale on the patterns that we see. So the columns here, all the numbers, 2213, I, J, K, those are different water body IDs that the state uses for different sections of the freshwater St. Johns River. So I is just south of Black Creek, where that empties into the river, just north of the Shands Bridge. And that goes down to 2213N, so south or upstream, which is hard for my brain to do at least, that's where the Ocklawaha empties into the river, just south of Palatka, right? So on the right side of this figure is Palatka, and we're heading north as you move left. So those are the columns. Most of the figures in this section are going to be like this, so I'm going to belabor it a little bit. We've done something different this year too, where we've broken out seasons in the nutrient data. So we have wet and dry seasons. We know we have a summer wet season and then a winter dry-ish season, depending on the year, right? So this allows us to detect different patterns based on rainfall, precipitation patterns, and get a little finer detail on when nutrient levels may be high or low in each section of the river and tributaries. So to do this, instead of taking all of the data in a year and pooling them together and averaging them, we had to use a model for each year for each section of the river. Why is that important? So if we have lots of samples in the late spring and early summer, for example, which we typically do, and then fewer samples in the winter, if we pool all those together, the average we get is going to tell us a lot more about the spring and summer than it will about the winter, just because there's more samples there, right? So by modeling each year, we can account for that difference in sampling effort. And the sampling effort in our basin is astounding, right? Local, state, federal agencies the time and personnel and funding that they put towards collecting these nutrient data is incredible. So we'd like to put it to good use. So that's a little bit behind why we made this change in the report, and hopefully it lets people drill down into the data a little bit and find patterns that maybe were hidden before. So all that to say, for the freshwater main stem, all of the sections, they're in the blue, right? So they're lower than our water quality criterion. They are satisfactory in their level overall, and there's been long-term declines. So the early 2000s had higher levels than today. The one point of concern that we have is for 2213K, which is around Racy Point, where Deep Creek empties into the river. And the last couple of years there, we would like to keep an eye on that one moving forward to make sure levels aren't starting to approach that water quality criteria. For the marine main stem, again, we have the same thing. These are all sections of the main St. Johns River, but moving now from 2213H on the right, so just north of Black Creek, moving up into downtown Jacksonville around D, and then hooking east towards the ocean, C, B, and then A right at the mouth. So going from the Atlantic Ocean on the left of the screen upstream. And we have, again, satisfactory levels in general and a long-term decline compared to the early 2000s. Now, for nitrogen, looking at the data, we don't see a strong impact of season in most places. So wet and dry concentrations for the whole data set are pretty similar, actually, which is not what we see for phosphorus, which I'll talk about next. For phosphorus, it's a little trickier than nitrogen. Freshwater main stem is satisfactory, and it has been for a while. Phosphorus is a limiting nutrient in freshwater systems, so it gets used up pretty quick. Nitrogen on the salty side. But we have some concern about the marine main stem, and the tributaries, again, are in general not satisfactory for total phosphorus. This is a very similar plot to the nitrogen data, but now for total phosphorus levels, another key nutrient. We have wet and dry seasons as the two different rows, and again, we're going from about Black Creek on the left, upstream to Palatka or the Ocklawaha on the right side. And in general, right, the levels are satisfactory, they're below our criteria, and they've been pretty stable over the last several decades. If we look at the marine main stem, however, and this is where splitting out these different sections of the main stem can be interesting, we can see an increase generally in concentrations as you go from the right side of this figure, so Black Creek moving up towards downtown Jacksonville, a peak in concentrations generally around downtown, and then a slight decline after that as the river moves towards the ocean. And mostly, levels are satisfactory in the marine main stem, especially in the dry season if you're not close to downtown. But if you are close to downtown and you're in the wet season, some of those years recently have been above our water quality criterion that we use for the purposes of the report only. It's not what they're regulated by. So we have some concern in those seasons and those areas for total phosphorus in the main stem. I mentioned the tributaries before, and now we're going to get into the weeds a little bit. So generally, nitrogen, I said, was satisfactory in the tributaries. But as was mentioned earlier, which tributary matters. So finding where you live and which water body you're interested in and looking for those specific data is important. So these are all by their water body ID, and we'll see if my studying will pay off in remembering which ones these are. But for tribs south of Black Creek, so Black Creek itself is 2415, those first two. Then we have Deep Creek, which is 2549, and then Rice Creek, which shows a wonderful success story of decreasing nitrogen compared to very high levels 20 years ago. And then 2606B on the very right is Crescent Lake. So you can see for Deep Creek, a couple years are above that water quality criterion. So that tributary is of concern for nitrogen, but the rest are generally good. Just to give you a sense, again, this is just a subset of the data available in the report. This time going north of Black Creek, we have Pablo Creek, or the Intracoastal Waterway, on the very left, the Cedar River next, freshwater portion of Moncrief, and then the freshwater portion of the Ortiga after that. And so, again, it depends where you are, but total phosphorus in general is not satisfactory in the tributaries, especially in the wet summer season. But in some places it is, right? So the Ortiga freshwater, 2249A, actually looks pretty good, even in the wet season. So it's a big area, as Dr. Baynard mentioned. We have a lot of data, and there is seasonality at play. So it makes it pretty tricky to understand what's happening over time. Right, so that's the nutrient section, but I wanted to mention too that we've reorganized the tributary section in this year's report. So instead of having each individual tributary listed individually and alphabetized, we have grouped the tributaries together based on geography. And we've tried to use cutoffs, shown here in green, that are easy for everyone to know. So the Memorial Bridge in Palatka to Racy Point, just north of Hastings, for example. That's one section in this new organization of the tributaries. So what we do for each of these then is have a map like this for which section of the river these tributaries empty into. We then go into some background information about each section of the river and which tributaries or sub-watersheds we're talking about. So for example, for this section of the river, it's still quite wide, more like a tidal lake than a tidal river. It has a muted tide of about 1 foot, and it is fresh almost all of the time, except on very, very rare occasions where it gets just a tiny bit of salt, but it's mostly fresh. Then on the west here, so to the left, those 2, 5, 6, 7s, that's Rice Creek watershed. On the opposite side of the river is the Deep Creek watershed. That includes Deep Creek, which number is 2549, and then 16 Mile Creek, which empties into it, 2589. After giving that background, each of the tributary sections now goes into known or historical issues in water quality. So what impairments are there in the watershed or subwatershed historically? What has been done about those impairments? For example, Rice Creek is not impaired, but Deep Creek and 16 Mile Creek are impaired for iron, at least in the last assessment. And Deep Creek additionally has had issues with nutrients, so high phosphorus and low dissolved oxygen for this example. Once we set the stage for issues that have happened in the past, then we move on to the last section for this new organization of the tributaries and talk about water quality today. And that's where we get into the data. So what do the data show us, if there are data, about those issues that we know exist or have existed? Where do we see improvement? Where do we see problem areas that need to be looked at further? And those figures look something like this. So this is data from the Deep Creek watershed. Again, Deep Creek is 2549, and 16 Mile Creek is 2589 on the right. So we have the different subsections of that watershed, and we really wanted to show you as much of the data as we could in these new figures for the report this year. So we then have selected water quality measures as the different rows. So for Deep Creek, we have dissolved oxygen, iron, specific conductance, which is like salinity, and then total phosphorus. These are things that we know have been issues in the past. two more things I want to mention about this, because we've tried to pack these figures with a lot of information so you can sit with them for a bit. The size or area of each dot is the number of samples. So a really tiny pinpoint is just a handful of samples. And a really large dot is 100, or in very few cases, more than 100 samples taken in that 1 year. So that tells us, for example, that 16 Mile Creek in general has fewer samples taken every year than Deep Creek. And in the last couple of years, Deep Creek has had a lot of water quality samples for total phosphorus compared to in the past. Right? So that gives you a sense of how well sampled the tributary you're interested in is. If you see a gap or nothing, then there's no data. There's no samples that either were in the state database or made it through QA/QC. The last thing I'll mention on this is the color. So this is a colorblind friendly palette, and the darkness and lightness of that color are how many samples are above that water quality criteria. So if we look at total phosphorus on the bottom, for example, Deep Creek is about as bright yellow as you can get. So basically every single sample taken is above the water quality criteria. And the average, which these are geometric means, so less sensitive to outliers, is twice what we'd like it to be for total phosphorus. If you compare that to 16 Mile Creek, there are many fewer samples that are above the water quality criterion, and the average is below it, so it's a darker shade. So I want to show just two more examples to drive home the point that it depends on where you are. So this is the Shands to Buckman section. That's Julington-Durbin Creek on the east side there, Doctor's Lake, Black Creek to the west. This is Julington-Durbin. So Julington Creek on the left, Durbin Creek on the right. I show this to show that even if water bodies are right next to each other, they could have strong differences in how much data is available, so the sampling intensity. So Julington Creek does not have very much nutrient data available, but Durbin Creek does. And they could have different levels. So E. coli is much more likely to be above where we'd like it to be in Julington compared to Durbin, given the samples we have. And lastly, another section, just to show you the maps, Buckman to Fuller Warren bridges. We have a lot of sections of the Ortega and Cedar rivers that we report on. It's a big area, a lot of development, and folks interested in that area. This is just the freshwater sections of that watershed. So the freshwater Ortega, and then Cedar, Wills Branch, and then Butcher Pen Creek from left to right. And this just shows that even within one subwatershed, the Ortega-Cedar River, in the freshwater portions, there are big differences in water quality and sampling effort. So hopefully this reorganization of the tributary section and the reanalysis of the nutrient section gives folks in the public and other stakeholders, agencies, actionable information for where we can celebrate our successes, where we still have work to do, and where maybe we don't have enough data yet to know which. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Pinto.
Thank you, Scott. Wow, I think that just really shows how dynamic the system is, and then on top of that, how difficult it is to interpret information, because we have information in some areas and very little in others, and it's quite patchy. So let's talk a little bit about salinity. So salinity trends we have as worsening, and this is looking at the long-term trend. And of course, we have rising sea levels. This is data taken from the Buckman Bridge continuous sampling array. And so the other thing you'll notice here in this graph is there's a lot of spikes. And certainly since 2017, after Irma, we have some interesting spikes compared to when we last had a period, and the Water Management District folks talk about the comparison about periods after storms, like in 2024, in 2004, we had those four hurricanes that came through Florida. the salinity profiles in the river were very different. So they're quite dynamic. They go up and down quite a lot. But we do have some years where we have high salinity for extended periods of time. And that, of course, affects the system. Here's some sampling sites that the city of Jacksonville collects data at. And we can see that when we go from the northmost site, this is the Dames Point Bridge. The next one is near Jacksonville University. The third one down is Piney Point, and then, of course, near Doctors Lake. We see that salinity is increasing over time in these data sets. This data set is about almost just shy of 30-year long duration. But you can see that as you go down these criteria on the left, you'll see the stars there indicating significant increases in salinity at different levels in the water column. And of course, down there near Doctors Lake, where you're starting to enter that freshwater zone more, you're starting to see salinity creeping in there. And this is going into what I'll refer to as the transition zone later. And you'll see how these things, particularly salinity, is affecting the habitat like the grass beds that are really freshwater grasses. So we have a lot of salinity stress in the system to the north, less so in the south. And just keep that theme as we proceed here. What are the impacts of salinity? Well, obviously the transition zone will move further south, and this is most likely to affect mostly freshwater species. The marine species shouldn't be affected as much, but definitely freshwater species, particularly those dependent on SAV, submerged aquatic vegetation habitat. Salinity changes could, because of this change in transition zones, affect life cycle disruptions. So we have a massive crab fishery in the St. John's alluded to earlier that could be affected, and certainly fish species too, freshwater fish species. The critters that live in the mud, the worms and the macroinvertebrates, the ones without backbones, those kind of organisms are also going to be affected by these changes. Those are the ones we don't really see that much, but they're there, and they're a very important part of the ecosystem. Less SAV, less submerged aquatic vegetation because of the salinity stress. This is something we've seen over the last 30 years in the northern section of the river for sure. As I said before, those grasses are freshwater grasses, so they're very sensitive to salt. The other thing that the salinity is affecting quite significantly is wetlands. So we have freshwater wetlands, hardwood swamps in the basin. About 80% of those are freshwater, and probably just shy of half of those are wooded. And so, I'm talking about when you go south in the river and you see the death of cypress trees and that kind of thing, that's what we're seeing because of salinity impacts. And this kind of shows you here, this is a graph showing time along the bottom. You've got salinity on the y-axis, and the red crosses there show you the maxima, the salinity maxima. So these are just showing you highs in salinity over the years. The point I want to make is that the salinity maxima have been high since Hurricane Irma, and that is something that has significantly impacted grass beds. And some recent work by the Water Management District in producing a report on grass bed recovery after storms, looking at the period after 2004 when we had those 4 storms pass through the area. The salinity maxima were not as high, and the grass beds did a lot better, recovering quicker. And that's not the case now. So things have certainly changed in the river in the last decade compared to a previous decade. Our fisheries seem to be doing fairly well in spite of all this. I will say that we have a massive blue crab fishery in the river. We produce over 1 million pounds of blue crabs every year out of the river. They could also be affected by salinity. there is some indication that their harvest levels have decreased over time. And this could be part of this climate change effect that's going on due to rising sea levels and increasing salinity moving south in the river. About 80% of our fisheries come from the blue crab fishery. The rest is mainly finfish, and mullet is a big portion of that. And this is really what I want to get onto, is talk about the grass beds, because our submerged aquatic vegetation is not in good shape. It hasn't been for a number of years now. Usually it's bounced back quicker than this from storms. But why is it important? It provides nurseries and food for a number of organisms in the environment. It improves and cleans our water. It helps to reduce erosion. It absorbs all kinds of contaminants. It sequesters carbon. Very important. We have a number of grasses in the river, but the main one, the predominant one, is Vallisneria, which is the tape grass on the left there that we were familiar with. Sometimes people call it manatee grass. Very sensitive to salinity, very sensitive to levels of light. So in the northern part of the river, as I mentioned earlier, we have this salinity stress that's constantly stressing the plants. Every time they get stressed by that salinity, their requirement for light goes up, and they're not necessarily getting it. Now, the further south you go in the river, when you get down to Palatka and some of the areas that Dr. Jones just mentioned, in those freshwater areas, it's not salinity that's the stressor, it's the light or the limited light that's the stressor. And why is it a problem? We're having higher water levels, and we're talking a few inches difference between this decade and the last decade, but we also have storms that churn up the system, and so you also have this turbidity in the water too. And so the plants are doing very badly trying to recover from that. They're in some places, from what the Water Management District folks report, the light requirement is reduced by almost 40%, which is very significant. Or the light level is reduced by 40%, so they're not getting half the light they need. And then there are other things that affect the grasses. Sometimes during the drought years, the water clears up, but you have these things called epiphytes that grow on the grass blades, and so they impede light in that way too. And then recently what's emerged is predation pressure on top of small plants that are trying to grow that aren't able to because of the organisms feeding on them. On the right, you'll see a number of years and numbers that represent the sampling sites. And so our sampling effort in the last few years has been fairly consistent. We're up at about 94, 95, 98 sites each year, so that's been fairly consistent. I want to sort of run through some areas of the river that I split this up into various segments. So this is the northern part of the river between the Fuller Warren Bridge and the Buckman Bridge. And if you just look at the graphs on the right, the ones on the top, the green represents the extents of these beds, how far they push out from the shore, basically, how long they are. The middle graph talks about how dense the beds are, basically how many patches of bare spots are in the transects that when we measure those, the amount of grass there, or when the Water Management District measures that. This is Water Management District data. And then on the bottom graph with the purple line, that's the Vallisneria or the proportional percent of Vallisneria relative to other grasses. And you can see that these are all down and have not popped back up in a while. In the text box, you can look at the different species of grasses that have been represented in that area historically at the bottom of the box, and then at the top of the box what we found, what was seen last year. And in many cases, you'll see that Vallisneria tends to be the predominant grass, Rupia in this case in this area. But think about the number of species that you're seeing as we go through these graphs, because you'll notice the diversity is starting to decrease as we go on further south here. And so this is the next section south, looking at the Buckman Bridge to the Hallows Cove. more freshwater area. This is the transition zone I sort of referred to earlier. You can see that the grasses, the extents are pretty much similar. They're doing in terms of their length out from the shore. But if you look at that middle graph, the density is terrible. It's very, very poor. And then it's predominantly made up of vallisneria. And if you look at the text box here in the middle, you can see, how many fewer species are now present compared to before. And of course, vallisneria is dominating. And as we go further south, a little bit more positive here. So here you're just north of Palatka down to Federal Point, Hallows Cove to Federal Point. You can see that there's some slight upward trends in the lines, which is showing some recovery occurring in this area. Again, diversity in terms of that text box, very, very much less. So it's still stressed. And then here south of Federal Point, going through the Palatka area, we can see that there's some kind of recovery going on. At least the density in the beds is increasing a little bit, mostly vallisneria. And then this is the area where salinity is not such a big deal. Here, light is the limiting factor. And also the river itself is very different. You notice it's much more riverine rather than lake-like that we have further north. But again, there is some recovery taking place in these sampling sites, which is a little bit of a positive note. It's nice to see that occurring there. Again, in terms of diversity, low on the diversity side. We have one predominant grass there, vallisneria. And I like to put this picture in. This is some work done by Eric Marzoff back in 23. I think I showed this last year. It kind of shows you going from 2015 to 2021. You'll notice we go on the left side of that word Irma, we have a lot more green. And on the right side of it, remember we're talking about these salinity spikes that have increased. We're seeing a lot less green, particularly in the northern area. And then further south, because of increased water levels, you're seeing less grass growth there. This next picture is taken from the Water Management District SAV dashboard, and it kind of shows you an extension of that work. And I've added on here years, and those percentages through the middle there show you the number of sampling sites that are bare. So if we start off on the left here, you'll see that we had 61 sampling sites, or they had 61 sampling sites. 20% of them were bare. And that number sort of increases over time to 2024, where we're up at 31% of sites bare. And that is sort of, still pretty high, and we're kind of hoping that that goes down now. And then one of the other things I report on is these endangered and threatened species, actually. I think when we started this report, some of them were still endangered, like the manatee, and since then have been downlisted. You can see that here on these graphs. Bald eagles, for example, have taken some kind of hit after Irma and are showing some recovery again. The general trend is up, so bald eagles are doing well. I noticed a couple in my neighborhood the other day, so it was very nice to see them around. Wood storks, not doing so great. More recently, the trend, the long-term trend is up, but more recently they've taken a hit. And I think partly that's due to these northeasters we've been having, which tend to damage their nests and things, but also we have increased water levels. And the way these organisms or these birds feed is they like pools of water that are not too deep, because it tends to concentrate their food, and the way they feed by actually touching their food and then snapping at it makes it harder for them to feed. So I think that might be affecting them too. Manatees, we've had this incident in the Indian River Lagoon where a large number of them died because of starvation. We're starting to see animals coming into the area who are staying in the area more. It may be because some of the grasses are recovering. They tend to move out of our area looking for food more. when they have sparse food supplies. But I think in our area, they seem to be doing fairly well. We've had an increase in perinatal deaths, which is something that you tend to see after an event like a starvation event, where the body condition of animals is depressed for some time, and then as they come out and improve in body condition, they start to have more babies, and then the death rate goes up just automatically. So it looks bad, but it's normal. It's something that you would expect to see. And before I turn this over back to my colleague, Dr. Bielmeyer, you'll notice there's a QR code on this screen that if you would like to report your manatee sightings, there's a form that will link to that QR code on our website at Jacksonville University, and you can actually upload your sightings information from your phone and even include a picture. So we want to involve the community in some of this data collection and interaction with this report, and so we'd appreciate that if you're interested in doing that. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Moving on to contaminants. The classes of contaminants that were covered in this year's report include metals and metalloids, polyaromatic hydrocarbons or PAHs, polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs, pesticides, pharmaceuticals, and per and polyfluoroalkyl substances or PFAS. So for PAHs, there have been no new data since 2003, so I'm not going to talk about PAHs today. It's also worth noting that there have been no new PCB data since 2017, and the data for metals, metalloids, and pesticides have been greatly reduced over the past 10 years. Pharmaceuticals and PFAS are emerging classes of contaminants. So the first pharmaceutical data became available in 2015, and different pharmaceuticals have been added every year. For all the classes of contaminants, excluding PFAS, the data were obtained from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection WIN and STORET databases. PFAS is not available in those databases. However, a recent publication by Camacho et al. 2024 enabled me to actually get some PFAS data from the state of Florida just this past year. And there's also a freely available website from Dr. John Bowden's laboratory in the University of Florida. So metals and metalloids are the first class of contaminants I'm going to speak about. Metals are naturally occurring elements in the sediment. However, they are extensively used in modern society, resulting in contaminated waterways. Many contaminated waterways, including the St. Johns River. Metals in the freshwater mainstem are generally satisfactory and within acceptable limits. However, many of the metals in the saltwater portion of the mainstem are unsatisfactory. They are higher than the acceptable limits, particularly for copper, aluminum, lead, nickel, and zinc. Other metals like arsenic, cadmium, silver, and selenium have actually improved, so the concentrations have reduced over recent years, and now they have the satisfactory status. Most metals, excluding arsenic, cadmium, and selenium, metals are generally above acceptable limits in the tributaries. So we kind of have a recurring theme about water quality, poor water quality conditions, excess contaminants in the tributaries of the lower St. Johns River. So this graph shows mercury concentrations in the sediment of the St. Johns River, and it's pretty indicative of the metal concentrations, of the other metal concentrations in the sediments, and this is ranging from 2008 to 2024. So just to give you an idea of the layout of this graph, the solid lines indicate the probable effect level for marine areas and the probable effect concentration for freshwater areas. Now, these are the thresholds above which we would see most species affected. Okay, and then there are also the dotted lines, which represent the threshold effect level for marine environments and the threshold effect concentration for freshwater environments. And these are the thresholds above which we start to see effects in the sensitive species. So while mercury concentrations have decreased over time, specifically since 2016, we've seen a lowering of the mean mercury concentrations in the sediment. These sediment concentrations still have a higher mercury concentration than the thresholds. The mean values are higher than the TEL and TECs, and many of the individual concentrations are higher than the PEL and PECs. So these are still unacceptable, and we could potentially see effects from mercury. Now, the reason why mercury is a more studied metal is because it does accumulate and actually magnify up the food chain. And so the organisms that are higher in the trophic or in the food chain, like sharks and humans, alligators, are going to have higher concentrations of mercury. So this is a fairly persistent metal in the environment. And to relate this to a meal, for example, the mercury concentrations that are found in the sediment are pretty indicative of what you might find in the fish as well. And the mercury concentration threshold is 0.3 part per million or milligram per kilogram for the general population. For more sensitive populations like pregnant women, nursing mothers, and children, that threshold value is 0.1 part per million. So the mean concentration of mercury in 2024 was higher than both of those thresholds. So that gives you an idea of, the fish that you consume from the lower St. Johns River should be restricted. And I do get asked this question quite a bit, but which fish species should I eat? Or which can I eat, and which should be eaten sparingly, and so forth. So as I said, mercury is very persistent. It magnifies up the food chain. So the fish that are more fattier, the bigger fish that are higher on the food web, again, like mackerel and sailfish and tuna and Chilean sea bass, they're going to have higher mercury concentrations than other fishes like salmon, and also shrimp have a lower mercury concentration, crab. So they're lower on the food chain. They typically don't have as much mercury. So you can consume those more often. It doesn't mean that you can't consume the other fish, especially if you're a tuna lover, for example, but I would just eat those fish more sparingly. The next class of contaminants is polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. So these are synthetic mixtures of chemicals that were extensively used because they have these non-flammable and insulating properties. They were extensively used prior to the 1970s, and that's when the United States restricted their use. This graph shows the PCB concentrations in sediments that were collected from the St. Johns River in 2017, and these are our most recent data. So we have data for individual PCBs, and then on the far right, that's the total concentration of PCBs. The total PCB concentration does exceed the acceptable threshold, indicating that PCBs might be causing toxicity or threaten aquatic life. The other thing I wanted to note about PCBs is the main concern and the reason why their use was restricted is because, like mercury, PCBs do magnify up the food chain, and they do persist. They persist in the environment because they are very stable, which made them ideal for use in a variety of products. But because they're so stable, they don't break down very easily. And they do cause endocrine disruption and immune system disruption. The most notable effect would be fertility. There have been reduced fertility in organisms that are higher in the food web, like alligators. We've seen that happen in alligators quite a bit, and also birds and larger fish species. The next class of contaminants is pesticides. So these graphs represent the pesticide concentrations in the water of the St. Johns River from 2014 to 2024. The graph on the left is the box and whisker plot. So the green horizontal line represents the median values, and the box represents the upper and lower quartiles. The graph on the right shows the mean and standard deviation of the data. The median and mean total pesticide concentration in the lower St. Johns River water column have increased since 2014. The same pattern was seen in the tributaries where the maximum concentrations were observed. Total pesticide concentration varied among tributaries, just like a lot of the other water quality parameters we've discussed, but some of the highest values were observed in Doctors Lake and McCullough Creek. So these graphs represent the organochlorine or OC pesticide concentrations in water. The OC pesticides are the really nasty ones, the concerning ones. They biomagnify, they persist, they're very toxic. So they're not used as extensively as some of the newer pesticides. However, they still linger in the environment, and we have seen an increase in the concentration since 2014. The organochlorine pesticide concentration in the sediments were generally high in 2005 and 2007. However, we don't have any new data since then. So we can't really say anything about the trend. Now they are persistent, so it's likely that they're still found in the environment at the same concentrations or similar. But again, we really don't know what the trend is for the pesticide concentrations or the OC pesticide concentrations in the sediment. Okay, the next class of contaminant is pharmaceuticals and personal care products. The pharmaceuticals that were evaluated in this year's report include the nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories, acetaminophen, ibuprofen, and naproxen, the opiate analgesic, hydrocodone, the anticonvulsant, carbamazepine, and also a very common component of pharmaceuticals as well as a lot of food and beverages, caffeine. And also a recent addition is a synthetic chemical component of sunscreen called avobenzone. Now, the fact that we're even detecting these pharmaceuticals in the St. Johns River is concerning. They are not naturally occurring. None of these are naturally occurring products. And we've started to detect them, and for several of them, like ibuprofen shown in the top middle graph, you can see there's an upward trend where these concentrations are increasing. So again, we don't know the long-term repercussions of having all of these synthetic chemicals in the environment. They are likely affecting aquatic life and accumulating in aquatic life. But again, we don't know the long-term repercussions. Okay, the last class of contaminant I'm going to speak about today are per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. So PFAS constitute a diverse group of highly fluorinated synthetic chemicals, including over 7,000 different substances. For over 60 years, they have been used in a variety of industrial and commercial products, including stain and water repellents for textiles, paper products, and food packaging, like the popcorn container and the Kentucky Fried Chicken cup shown in the picture. Also, they're used for nonstick coatings on cookware, like Teflon, as well as in surfactants and firefighting foams. Two of the more commonly studied compounds, PFAS compounds, are PFOA and PFOS, and their chemical structure is shown in these pictures. So we have a variety. I mean, as I said, over 7,000 different compounds, but there are a handful that have just begun to be studied, really over the past 10 years. Oh, and I should note too, although we don't have a full picture of the myriad of effects, of these PFAS compounds. We do know that some of the compounds can persist in the environment indefinitely, which is why they're called the forever chemicals. And some of the noted or observed effects so far have been suppressed immune system, altered thyroid function, liver disease, lipid and insulin dysregulation, kidney disease, altered reproduction and development, as well as cancer. So currently there are no statewide or state-specific maximum contaminant levels. So the state of Florida uses maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, of 4 nanogram per liter for PFOA and PFOS, and 10 nanograms per liter for a few other of the PFAS compounds. Now these MCLs were established by the US EPA on April 10th in 2024, so just fairly recently. And so the state of Florida has adopted those and is using those MCLs. The graph to the left shows PFAS concentrations in the counties surrounding the lower St. Johns River. And the MCL value is depicted in the red dotted line of 4 nanograms per liter. Every county had PFAS concentrations higher than the 4 nanograms per liter. And the greatest exceedances were observed in Clay and Duval County. Duval County had a concentration of 867 nanograms per liter. And again, the MCL is 4. So it gives you an idea of how prevalent these chemicals are and how persistent. The graph to the right shows the individual PFAS concentrations, as well as the sum of the total PFAS concentrations in the bar on the far right. And this is statewide, so these are all from the state of Florida. The PFOA, PFOS, and a couple other compounds have far exceeded the 4 and the 10 nanogram per liter MCL values. And the sum of the PFAS far exceeded the 4 and 10 nanogram per liter MCL values. So this gives us an indication that, okay, these PFAS compounds might be very concerning in the environment. They've been found now in human blood. They've been found in a variety of different wildlife species, and it's vital that we not only monitor PFAS concentrations in the state of Florida, but the entire nation and elsewhere. So PFAS monitoring is vital. This is one snapshot. These data were collected in 2020 and 2021. I've been told that the state is going to start monitoring for PFAS in 2027. So hopefully that'll happen, and we'll be able to see more trends in the data. Although I anticipate, given their extensive use and their prevalence in the environment, that we're going to see an increase in the concentrations of these compounds. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today.